Hi everyone, welcome back to Nusantara Folktales with me. And today I'm going to be telling you a folktale. Actually, it's from a hikayat, which is so popular. I'm sure every one of you has heard of this story. It's been made and adapted many, many times. I even attempted to adapt this story several times. So I have many different versions of the story, and I wanted to read out to you one of the failed versions, the one that didn't quite it wasn't suitable for what I was doing, but it's still very good. I haven't found a place for it, so I thought I would read it to you today. So Raja Bersiung, of course, comes from Hikayat Merong Mahawangsa. I have the silverfish copy of Merong Mahawangsa, and it's on chapter 8. This is a really good version of Raja Bersiung if you're interested. I'm not sure whether they still have copies, but I'm sure you can find it secondhand or online. I started adapting a version which took the point of view of the palace cook. I don't know. I just thought it would be something interesting, and I really like this version. But it wasn't, like I said before, it wasn't suitable for what I wanted to do. So I've since rewritten it. It's more in line with this version, but in my words, and it will be in the second volume of Nusantara, A Sea of Tales. So this is the first volume, and it's available at all good bookshops. It's available online as well. So I'm currently working on the second volume, which is going very, very slowly because I'm also working on a new project. I'll tell you more about that. It's very exciting. And I tend to work on the things that I'm most drawn to at any given time. So unfortunately, volume 2 of Nusantara has been pushed back several times. I mean, I still enjoy writing the folktales, but when I get the urge to finish a story or write a story, I tend to immerse myself in that project. So anyway, let me read to you my failed version of Raja Bersiung. Okay, I'm just going to read it to you. Computer is right in front of me, so I'll be looking that way. So excuse me. Raja Bersiung. The royal cook was in the kitchen preparing the king's broth under the watchful eyes of the royal housekeeper. "You must hurry. The king is in the banquet room and he wants his dinner," cried the housekeeper, wringing her hands. The king was in an awful temper. The cook sliced the chili over the broth and accidentally cut the tip of her finger. She watched as ruby red drops of blood fell into the king's broth and dissolved into the liquid. The royal housekeeper strode up to the pot and ladled the broth into the bowl herself. Fatima looked on in horror as the broth containing her blood was carried into the royal banquet hall to be served to the king. All through the meal, the cook paced the balcony outside the kitchen. She was convinced that she would be fired, if not sentenced to death, for allowing the king to eat something sullied by her common blood. Oh, why had she not stopped the royal housekeeper from serving that horrible broth? As she predicted, once the evening meal was over, she was summoned to appear before the king. Of late, the foul-tempered king had been plagued by restlessness, and the cook knew that her punishment would be harsh. The cook entered the throne room with her eyes locked to the ground. When she reached the king, she fell to her knees and placed her forehead on the floor. Her whole body trembled with fright. "Your Royal Highness, please forgive me for what I have done," she pleaded. The king frowned at his cook. "Explain yourself." The cook pushed herself up from the floor but did not dare look at the king. She was shaking so badly that she could hardly speak. "Forgive me, Your Royal Highness. I have done you a great disservice. I was distracted when I prepared your broth, and I accidentally cut my finger." The cook held up her bandaged finger. "A drop of my blood fell into your broth, Your Royal Highness." Her voice shook as tears fell down her cheeks. and before I could stop them, the broth was taken into the banquet hall and served to your Royal Highness." There, she had confessed. The hardest part was over, and now she must wait to hear what her punishment would be. She prayed that her life would be spared, for she was a widow and had 3 young children and an elderly mother to care for. She waited, and after a while began to wonder whether the king had heard her words. Fearing the worst, Fatima glanced at the king and, to her astonishment, found him smiling in a dreamy way. Forgetting royal conventions, she asked him whether he was feeling ill. The king looked at her and, for the first time since her confession, spoke. "I feel wonderful, better than I have felt in a very long time. Your special broth has somehow revived my appetite and spirits. I summon you here tonight to appoint you as the head cook to my royal kitchen." The cook was so stunned she thought she might faint. She could not believe her ears. The king had enjoyed her broth, the broth which contained a drop of blood, no less. "But, Your Royal Highness," she began to protest, but the king interrupted her. "Now that I know what has restored my appetite, I order you to cook all my meals using this secret ingredient. Do you understand what I'm saying, cook?" She thought she might have imagined it, but the king's eyes began to glow. She quickly cast her eyes down to the floor. "Yes, my king." She wondered if she would have to bleed herself to death in order to feed the monster in front of her. As if to answer her question, the king spoke again. "My royal guard will make the arrangements to obtain the secret ingredient for you. You will be the only cook allowed to prepare my meals from now on. You are dismissed." The cook nodded and then slowly backed out of the throne room, careful not to look at the king. The next day she waited anxiously in the kitchen for the special ingredient, which soon arrived in a covered pot. It was heavy, and she shuddered at the thought of how the blood was procured. She had a suspicion that it came from the prisoners kept in the palace prison. "God forgive me." She said a prayer and began the grisly task of cooking the king's meal using the blood of his people. Orders were given to ensure that she was alone in the kitchen as she prepared the king's meal, curried greens cooked in human blood. It was ghastly, and she almost vomited from the smell, but she pressed on, knowing that she would be killed if she refused the king. From that day onwards, the king ate and savored every meal. As days passed, he became more and more fearsome. His body seemed to grow bigger and stronger. He had the energy and vitality of the young, but his face took on a sinister look. He became pale, and his eyes bloodshot and wild. The king's advisors and servants grew to fear his savage temper. Rumors soon spread across the land that something evil had taken over their king. There was talk of how the king would lie in his bedchamber all day, only to emerge once the sun was down. There was talk of the strange food coming from the palace kitchen and of how people around the palace suddenly went missing. In fact, there were no more prisoners. All of them had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. One day, the king was taken around the city on his covered palanquin to celebrate the harvest festival. People lined the streets, curious to see their king, but the palanquin was carried by many guards and was covered by a thick curtain so that no one could see the king's face. As the procession moved down the street, a small child caught sight of a cat and ran across the road, bumping into one of the bearers. The palanquin fell to the ground and the curtains opened to reveal the true face of the king. Everyone on the street saw it with their own eyes. The king had grown a pair of tusks, which protruded from his mouth and hung over his lower lip. They saw his pale skin, sharp claws, and manic red eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke and the street was completely silent. That is, until a baby cried and a woman screamed. Stricken with terror, the people ran away from the king, for they saw that he was no longer a human being. Their king had now turned into an evil, hideous monster. Furious at the reaction of his people, the king ordered his army to burn the villages and take the people as prisoners. They were disloyal to the king and had to be punished. When the cook heard the news, she ran home to save her children. But it was too late. Her family had been taken away to the palace prison. The cook fell to the ground, for she knew what punishment awaited her children and all the people of the city. That night, something changed inside her, and she resolved that she would no longer cook for the evil fanged king. She would fight him and save her people. Panic spread throughout the city as people tried to escape. More and more prisoners were taken by the king to satisfy his bloodlust. In the tumult, the cook joined a group of fighters and one night sneaked into the palace to assassinate the king. When the king's guards saw the fighters, they decided to join them, for they too hated and feared the fanged king. Slowly, the fighters crept towards the king's bedchambers. Just as the sharp blade of the cuirass was about to stab the slumbering king, he stirred and woke up. Horrified, the king leapt up and with superhuman powers flew out of his bedroom window. They saw him fleeing like an animal towards Mount Jerai. The fighters tried to track him down in the mountains, but the fanged king was clever and learned ways to evade capture. The Fang King was left to live the rest of his existence in the jungle. Rumors abound that his descendants have survived to this day. The end.